So I am so excited to be talking to you today, Carlos, and the exciting news that you are going to join the Brahmani team on our excellence and empowerment teacher training, level 2 advanced teacher training that starts in September.
I'm also super excited because in our conversations, I see that we have similar understanding about the history of yoga and its relevance to the modern world and so on. So I'm really like super just looking forward to this training to really go deeper into the reality of the tradition of yoga.
Yeah, I feel so honored and privileged that you're going to join us because I know you've got an
Thank
amazing
you.
reputation around the world. So yeah, this means a lot to me. And to give our students a better idea about some of the stuff that you're going to bring to us, I'm just going to ask you a few questions so you can riff on it and give people
Great.
some more insight to where we're headed. And my first one, and this is a question I'm always so passionate about investigating myself and bringing students into, is there's a lot of misconceptions about what we used to think was yoga history and yoga philosophy, and now we've learned through research and people diving into that that deeper work, that a lot of the stuff wasn't quite true. So in your discovery, in your work, what would you say, list your top 3 misconceptions that quite often leads yoga teachers astray?
Yes. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think you said it just perfectly. I've been doing yoga long enough. I'm dating myself here to see the evolution of the
Mhm.
understanding of yoga and yoga history. Because when I started, it was like 50 and no, not quite 50 years, but 40 plus years ago. And in those days, really nobody knew, and it hadn't been studied, right? Whereas now, the study of yoga and the history of yoga is an academic discipline, right? So there's so much groundbreaking research going on, and that's part of my excitement, is also to be able to share that with the students in the teacher training, because it's really rounding up our understanding. In that process, I myself have had to relearn certain things several times, right? So I understand that many of these wrong ideas have been circulating there just because they originated when people didn't know any better. But now we have no excuse. so,
True.
so for example, number one is calling Patanjali the father of yoga. I always say, no, Patanjali is like a good uncle that gives you good advice. He's very sweet that way, particularly when you study his commentary on his sutras. You see the tone and also the helpfulness of the teaching. But the importance of Patanjali has been exaggerated, right? And it's when you look at the history, you realize that before Patanjali, there was already like 1,000 years of yoga, practice yoga history. And that in fact, he's inheriting all of that. And by the way, he's implying that from Sutra number 1. He's implying that in his choice of words, that he's not presenting something new, but traditional teaching. He says that. So this is one of the things that is very helpful, to put things in the right place, right? And connected with that, and number 2, I would say, is that he has no connection with Hatha yoga. Now,
Thank you.
the connection there is understandable. The mistake when we didn't know, how old is Hatha yoga. Now we know. And now we know that the oldest text that we have, that without using the term Hatha yoga, references the core practices of Hatha yoga, is from the 11th century. Whereas Patanjali, who, by the way, now we can date him, which before, when I started, nobody was sure about his date. Now we are. There's like 600-year gap. Patanjali was working before Hatha yoga even existed. And when you look again, the history, the context, right, and the literature, all of it, when Patanjali is talking about asana, he could not possibly be referring to Hatha yoga or anything remotely resembling Hatha yoga. He was talking about the literal meaning of the word asana, which means sitting posture. So Patanjali is great. Same thing, by the way, with pranayama, right? At that time, there's absolutely no evidence of any of the later pranayamas that we find in Hatha yoga. That's a later development. Patanjali, therefore, is a wonderful resource, and I absolutely love him for meditation.
Yeah.
Anybody who wants to study meditation, I say, hey, look, go there. Particularly, like currently I'm conducting a study group on the reading his commentary, and it's really fantastic resource for meditation. I love it. Is he gives so much insight and really practical, helpful information. So that's his right place. In terms of the connection with Hatha Yoga, for example, to have this idea that that you start with the asanas of Hatha Yoga and that then somehow you sort of graduate to the meditation of Patanjali, it's also off the wall, because Hatha Yoga develops its own type of meditation. Actually, one of the main methods of meditation that you find in Hatha Yoga is what's called Nada Nusandhana, which is sort of a contemplation on the inner sounds. You could translate it that way. So in other words, there's no need, no offense, Mr. Patanjali, but there's no need for his methods. And also because Tantra Yoga arises in a Tantric environment, it's a completely different approach to meditation. Patanjali's approach is that traditional one of reducing the thoughts in your mind. It's the oldest, it's literally the oldest approach in the book. And it works wonderful. But Tantra has different approach, and when you start really sort of looking under the hood of Tantric meditation, you realize that it works by affecting the flow of prana, or vital energy, in the body, which in turn translates immediately into your experience, because prana is what feeds the mind. So depending on the functioning of prana is how our mind is operating. So this is the basis when you look at this type of tantric meditation. That's the basis. It has nothing to do with whether you're having many vrittis, many thoughts or not. Completely different principle, right? So it is. It's a distortion, really, and that's the thing. I think it's important for us to learn as accurately as possible the original teachings in their original context. Then we figure out what we do with that. Right? But if we already start with a distorted picture, then what are we going to do? Right? Chances are it might not end well.
Yeah.
And then the third, because you asked me for three, right?
Three. I asked you for three. Yeah.
All right. The third one I would say is, I'm sorry, unfortunately, has been politicized. And I think it's really sad to politicize things that should be just a matter of, history or science. It's like politicizing vaccines. Let's solve the question scientifically, right? Let's not make it political, because then it gets weird. The history of yoga has become, unfortunately, politicized because there's a resurgence of nationalistic pride in India. There has been, and a part of that process has been to claim yoga in the name of Hinduism and to claim that yoga is Hindu. Unfortunately, facts are facts. And when you look at history, the picture that emerges is actually that although the Brahminical Vedic tradition, which later becomes Hinduism, does play, does contribute to the development of yoga, the evidence suggests that the origins of yoga are actually not Vedic, they're not Hindu, but non-Hindu. The traditions that are called Shramanas, of which, the two surviving ones are Jainism, Buddhism. That's where we really find the source of all these major practices, including, by the way, what Patanjali is presenting. What Patanjali is presenting is like 90% Buddhist and Jaina.
Right. Yeah.
And again, I don't think that this is it shouldn't be any problem. Like, what does it matter? It doesn't diminish Hinduism in any way, or it's still Indian. And like, I don't understand, as a non-Indian, I don't understand why this should be a problem, the origin of yoga. But I feel that, again, when we allow political or identity consideration to filter our study of history, is going to distort the picture, right? And I think as students, our allegiance should be only to the truth, whatever emerges, wherever the facts lead. And so personally, I don't care either way, like, what is the origin. But the the conversation about really the identity of yoga has been contaminated by political considerations. And this matters because it's not only about how we represent the past, no, but it's about the very question of what is yoga.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's so hugely important to try to answer that question, as I said, in context. For me, context is everything when we study anything from the past. So I hope that we can really move beyond this silly, it's an ego trip at the end of the day. You know, nationalism is an ego trip, like projected at the country level. And so I'm not a fan of nationalisms of any kind.
Yeah.
And so when we do this in yoga, I think it's a pity because it affects our ability to just be open-minded and see what can we learn from the history. What does the history say? And I'm open to wherever the evidence leads. So these are three things that I see of in the current sort of Hatha Yoga scene that concern me a little bit.
Yeah. And they're great. And I think you hit the nail on the head. And I know this is, what you're going to be presenting. I think our first weekend together is you have to put everything into context. And once people can see, historically the dateline of things and all the different trajectories of what influenced what, then you start to go, oh, okay, now this makes so much more sense. But at the root of it, it's kind of like, okay, but what does that mean about my own practice? We always have to remember at the end of the day, now that I have a better understanding, it doesn't mean I have to go and sit for hours in a coffee shop and argue with somebody else about potentially.
But this is the thing I always tell people in teacher training is, look, the single most important advice that I could give anybody who's teaching is separate fact from interpretation. It sounds much easier to do than it is, because as humans, we assume a lot. In fact, we're wired to assume what we don't know, right? And you have to really be careful, pay attention to distinguish the things that you're assuming, right? The gaps that you're filling up with assumptions from the things that you do know for certain. And in teaching, this happens a lot. And if we don't make that distinction, what happens is we're giving people our interpretation as if it were the original. Right? I always say there's nothing wrong with offering our interpretations. How can we not? I mean, as humans, we are going to have our own take on everything. Natural is natural. But please, I always feel an obligation, responsibility when I'm teaching to tell people, when I give my opinion, I always say, well, in my view, so that they know, okay, let's, take it or leave it. This is this guy's opinion. But when I'm talking about facts, I'm talking about facts. And we can reference those, right? We can point at sources and historical data. Right? So I think that this is a very important discipline that I would like to see more emphasized in Hatha Yoga teacher training programs. It's sort of an intellectual discipline, because a lot of what you see people teaching, again, may be wonderful, may be very valuable, but it's interpretation and is being presented as fact. The distinction matters a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. We all need to be, now more than ever, like we need to put our critical thinking to use.
Yes.
And
now
ask
more than
those
ever.
questions. Yeah. Now that we do have so many people that are studying and researching and making so much more information available, we've got to move away from assumptions, away from hearsay, away from, oh, well, my teacher says this, this, and this. It's kind of like, well, yeah, we've got to ask those deeper questions and think very critically and keep knowing that new information is still emerging, right? So it's kind of not only like, in my opinion, but also what we know now is, because in 10 years, something new might be discovered that, again, might affect how we perceive things. But at the same time, I always bring it back to, when you sit and meditate, when you get on your mat, when you're out there in the world every day, how does the information affect us? Because that's where the philosophy begins. It doesn't begin in the book. The book is just your reference, right?
Exactly.
Okay, Carlos, I'm going to move on to my second question, because this is actually, all three of these questions are things I love to, get into dialogue about. But I know you've done so much work in the Tantra world, and this is something that I'm very passionate about, since we've had so many misconceptions about Patanjali being this grandfather of yoga. But really, it's about looking at the importance of the Tantric lineage into the Hatha that we do today, that we see today. So, tell us more about that.
Yes, that's exactly one of the reasons why it's important to get history straight. Because I've been thinking for a long time that although I think it's okay for, and I think actually important for a level one type of Hatha Yoga training to really have an overview of history, I think there's too much emphasis given to Patanjali, as I said. And instead, what I would do, particularly for a level two training like we're going to do, is really focus more on Tantra, because Tantra is the environment where Hatha Yoga arises, number one. And also because although Tantra has been very misunderstood, right, in terms of its connection with sexuality, but actually the concern with sexuality is there at the heart of the origins of Hatha Yoga. But it's super important to understand why and how, right? Because again, sexuality is a very important dimension of our life, and it has to be put in this right, healthy place. And so what's happened is, number one, as you know, people now think that Tantra is really, it's about improving your sexual life. And that's really crazy, right? Because Tantra, first of all, it doesn't really emphasize sexuality. It's a very, percentage-wise, it's a very small part of Tantra that even employs sexuality. So it's already right there. It's a distortion to think that a Tantra equals sex. Tantra is so much more than sex. Number one. But number two, whatever is there of a sexual nature has nothing to do with improving your sexual life. That's a whole other concern, That's a whole other concern. People mix in the Kama Sutra and all of that. Yeah, no, the Kama Sutra is about technique. That's different. That's nothing to do with Tantra. So that's it's an important, very important point to be clear about, right? Again, nothing wrong with sex. I think we need to be more positive in our society about it. But the point is, understand Tantra, like every other form of yoga, is about self-awareness. It's about finding out your true nature, right? So it's not about improving any aspect of your life, sex or otherwise. So it is important to understand what is the goal. Now, keeping that in mind, the core practices of Hatha Yoga, we now know, are practices that, interestingly enough, were designed for people who were sexually active. The concern being the same concern that you see in history, in yoga, which is, how can I preserve my vital energy, right? There's a type of vitality that's called ojas in the medical system in India, that is also associated with, it's both associated with meditation practice, with deep practice, and with the reproductive function in the body. Right? So it's like a bank account, right? If you have only so much balance, you have to budget. And so if you're spending a lot of that energy in sexual activity, what happens is then that is not available for your practice. That has been a concern and understanding in yoga always from the beginning. Is why people promoted celibacy. So the departure here, we see that probably around the 10th century or thereabouts, right? Because we have mention of this by the 11th century, so that means it was existing prior to that, more or less, right? Give or take a century here, a century there. But we see this concern with, how can we preserve that ojas, that vitality in the body, even if being sexually active. And those practices are, as I said, they're at the core of Hatha Yoga. They're the practices that you find in what is called the mudra section, which is how to seal the energy, the vital energy in your body, in your system. And then around that core, a few centuries later, we see added the practices of asana, which are originally mostly sitting, and the practices of breath, and practices of meditation, like I was mentioning earlier. And so then by the 15th century, we have a model of Hatha Yoga that is, well-rounded and with all these elements. And interestingly enough, also, Hatha Yoga then becomes a hybrid, because on the one hand, we have this core, which comes from Tantra. It seems that is Vajrayana, Buddhist Tantra. Again, I say this with a grain of salt because that's based on our current state of knowledge, because the earliest sources that we found are in fact Buddhist. It doesn't mean that that's the source, right? So we need to be careful not to jump to conclusion, but Tantric, one way or another. And then it seems that these core tantric practices were co-opted, or I don't want to say appropriated because it has a negative connotation these days, which it shouldn't.
Yeah.
But it was appropriated by the ascetics, right? The sadhus, the discipline, male practitioners for the most part. And so we have this very interesting hybrid now where if you read carefully sources like the traditional source Hatha Pradipika, it's mostly is with reference to the male body, except for these core practices that I'm talking about, in which the female body is referenced. It's very, very interesting, right? And that tells us, it shows that the hybrid thing that Hatha Yoga became. So it's really fascinating to look into this evolution, and we can draw a lot of insight and a lot of conclusions for our own practice, right? And how we make it our own. But all of that wouldn't make much sense without some understanding of Tantra. And certainly, as I said, when you get to the meditation, it's Tantric meditation.
Yeah.
The terminology that is used to describe the stages of the path, the different inner experiences, all of that is Tantric items. So I think it's fundamental. And I would like to see more emphasis on Tantra in particular in advanced level trainings.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's that clear, putting it into context. When we see it in the context, it makes so much more sense that Hatha has, so much seeped in the Tantric philosophy.
Right.
Because when you look at the other, you look at the Brahmins, and then you look at the Vedas, and you look at, all, and Patanjali, you're like, okay, how do I make this match with what I'm doing? But yet Tantra is so clear, of course, because we're talking about energy, we're talking about prana, we're talking about the body. All of a sudden, we're talking about the body and the magic in the body, right? So
yes,
I think it's really, really important for us to get to that. So
it's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing. And I mean, after all these years, I'm still in awe of Hatha Yoga and how it works. It really is amazing. It still blows my mind.
Yeah, me too. Or else I wouldn't be doing it anymore.
Right.
All right. So, Carlos, I'm going to move on to my final question, at least for this conversation. So, moving forward, now that we're gathering all of this information, and of course, there's a lot of teachers. I mean, I would think most teachers out there are probably in a state of confusion more than anything. As we learn and grow more, what would be your advice to teachers moving forward? How do we, what's really valuable to bring to our students to carry this learning on with more clarity? What would be your advice moving forward?
Yeah. Well, number one, go to the roots. Go to the roots for all the reasons that we've been discussing. And I think it's so essential to have a clear sense, because I also feel a sense of responsibility that now, in some sense, we are carrying the tradition, right? It's all of us collectively that are going to be responsible for how yoga is going to be received by the next generation. I always feel a great sense of responsibility not to distort or even contaminate with my own ideas a tradition that has been maintained for centuries. It is one thing to have a tradition evolving from deep insight, from a great teacher's deep insight after a lifetime of teaching or after an experience of enlightenment. That is a very different type of of evolution than thinking, oh, I think this would be commercial,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then I'm adding something, oh, let's do naked yoga, for example. Look, don't get me wrong, if anybody wants to do it, it doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
It's a free world. But let's be clear, we're making it into something that it wasn't originally. And the process by which we do that, I think, needs to be handled very responsibly and very carefully. So I think being grounded, is like a tree. A tree can grow really big if its roots are deep enough. If the roots are shallow, first wind that comes, that thing has no strength. So that would be number one. Number two is that I always think of teaching as serving. It's very, very important. And for me, in my mind, anytime I do any teaching, the question in my mind is, what am I leading students with? So I think this is super important, that at the end of the day, we don't learn yoga because it's interesting, which it is, but we learn yoga because they are amazing tools. I mean, yoga changed my life and it gives meaning to my life day by day. It's yoga that has enabled me to, face the pandemic or whatever, So,
Yeah.
so at the end of the day, it's tools. And I think that's, for me, that should be number one, is what tools, what are we giving people, right? To give people inspiration is important, but inspiration may not necessarily help you as much as an actual tool, an actual practice. So I think those two things can really make all the difference in teaching and what we give, to the next generation.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it's a responsibility. And I think we do have to be very careful now, because we are responsible for how the next generations receive the yoga practices, because it is, you know, whatever anybody wants to argue about who owns yoga or whatever, it's you know, those of us that have been teaching, for 20 or more years, people, there's thousands and hundreds of thousands of yoga teachers, probably millions of yoga teachers, looking to senior teachers going, well, what comes next? We know, so many people are disappointed in the commercialism and the social media image that yoga is just about keeping fit and all of those sort of things. I think that the veneer on that is really starting to crack.
Right.
And so it comes with great responsibility and service. I always say, if I'm not here to serve, I better re-examine what I'm doing, because
Exactly.
we do have that responsibility to share the information with clarity, with context, with the tools, like you said. And it's hopefully, no, not hopefully, that's what we are bringing to this teacher training. No hope about it. It's a definite. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking this time to talk to me, Carlos. And I am so excited to get started on this teacher training. I know you're going to bring great insight, wisdom, and entertainment to the philosophy, really making it come alive, which is so important when we're learning. So
You should have fun also while doing all of that.
Absolutely. If it's not fun, let's not do it, right? All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you as well.